"Sir, your engine isn't broken. It's begging for help." Andre Vale, a billionaire who could buy silence, speed, and comfort without ever asking twice, stood beside his black sedan on a quiet roadside in the outskirts of Atlanta, staring at the smoke curling from under the hood as if the car had insulted him personally. He had no patience for delays, no habit of depending on strangers, and no reason to believe this day would be different from any other. Then he heard small footsteps. A little black girl in a faded yellow dress stopped a few feet away, clutching a scuffed backpack to her chest. Her hair was neatly braided, her shoes were worn, and her eyes were far too steady for someone her size. She did not stare at the car. She looked at him. "You should not keep trying to start it," she said softly. "It sounds worse every time." Andre gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "And you know that because you're an expert?" She shook her head. "Because my mother fixes cars when people in this town decide not to listen to her." That made him pause. The girl pointed toward a modest house across the street, where a woman in work boots was already walking out with a small toolbox in one hand and a calm, knowing expression on her face. There was no rush in her step, no fear of him, no awe either. Just purpose. Andre had spent years being surrounded by people who tried too hard to impress him. This woman seemed to care only about the problem. The girl moved closer, then stopped, as if measuring whether he could handle the truth. "My mom says rich people think help has to look expensive," the child said. "But sometimes it just needs someone who pays attention." The words landed harder than they should have. Andre looked back at the car, then at the mother approaching, and felt something unfamiliar. Not embarrassment, exactly, but the sharp irritation of realizing he had already judged the situation too fast. He had expected a mechanic, a tow truck, a quick fix, a clean exit. Instead, this little girl had turned his inconvenience into an uncomfortable mirror. The mother reached the curb, set the toolbox down, and asked one practical question. "Do you want the car running, or do you want the truth?" Andre almost answered with pride, almost told her to call a tow service and leave him out of it. But the girl's steady gaze stayed on him, not begging, not afraid, simply expecting him to be better than his first instinct. That expectation stung more than the breakdown. He glanced at the open road, then at the mother, then at the child beside her. For the first time in years, he felt control slip, not because he was powerless, but because someone tiny had made him aware of how often power had made him blind. The warning stayed with him as a mechanic stepped closer, but the billionaire did not move toward the car again. Instead, he looked at the mother and child with the same sharp attention he usually reserved for a boardroom deal. The little girl had not begged him for anything. She had simply told the truth. That truth now forced a choice. Call his driver, hand the problem to someone else, and keep pretending this was just a broken luxury car, or admit that the stranger beside the road knew more about the situation than he did. He hated that both options felt like losing something. If he refused their help, he would lose time, dignity, and perhaps the only chance to avoid embarrassing himself in front of people he had already underestimated. If he accepted it, he would lose the comfort of control, because for once he would have to follow someone else's lead. The mother noticed his hesitation and stepped in with calm confidence, asking for the hood release and explaining, in plain words, what the sound likely meant. Her certainty was not loud, but it was real. She did not act impressed by his money, and that unsettled him even more than the roadside delay. When he finally nodded, the girl moved first, not him. She pointed out a small detail near the front tire that he had missed completely, and the mother crouched to inspect it. The billionaire watched, realizing the situation had already shifted. He was no longer the man in command, but the one being shown what he had failed to see. Then came the part he had not expected. The mother asked if he had a flashlight, and when he reached for it, he saw how his own hands were shaking, not from fear of danger, but from the sting of being exposed. In that moment, the real risk was not the car at all. It was his pride, and the possibility that a child and her mother could teach him more about competence than all his expensive habits ever had. He exhaled, then stepped aside and let them work. And that simple surrender changed the meaning of the whole stop. The little girl stepped closer to Andre's sedan, not with the nervousness of a child seeking permission, but with the steady focus of someone who had already decided to help. She was small, with neat braids and a faded backpack hanging from one shoulder, and she looked from the smoking hood to Andre's face as if she could read both. My mama knows cars, she said softly, then turned and called, Mama, come here. He needs you. Andre blinked at the simple certainty in her voice. No sales pitch, no flattery, no fear. Just a child who had noticed a problem and believed her mother could solve it. A few seconds later, the girl's mother crossed the roadside shoulder carrying a tote bag and a calm expression that felt more useful than any tool Andre had ever seen. She was not dressed like someone who belonged in his world, and that was exactly why her confidence unsettled him. She did not rush to impress him. She did not apologize for the heat, the dust, or the fact that he was a billionaire standing helpless beside a broken car. Instead, she crouched near the front bumper, listened to the engine, and asked him two precise questions in a voice that made it clear she had handled worse than this before breakfast. Andre answered, still guarded, still expecting embarrassment to follow. But the girl stayed near the passenger door, watching him with an unreadable seriousness that felt far older than her age. She noticed the way he kept checking his watch even though the car was dead, and after a moment she said, Time does not help if the problem is not listened to first. The words landed hard. He had spent his whole life treating time like a weapon, something to spend, save, and use against anyone who slowed him down. Now a child was naming his weakness without cruelty. Her mother gave the girl a brief look, half warning and half pride, then explained that the car was not ruined, only overheated and badly neglected. She spoke with the patience of someone who had learned how expensive pride could become when it replaced common sense. Andre felt the old reflex rise in him, the urge to take charge, to call for someone better dressed, someone from his own network, someone who would not make him feel this exposed. But the mother had already opened the hood farther, and the girl had already found a bottle of water in her bag and offered it to him without hesitation. He almost refused on instinct. Then he saw the care in her hand, the same care that had sent her mother over in the first place, and something in him shifted. This was not charity dressed up as kindness. It was competence wrapped in dignity. He took the water, and for the first time since the car died, the roadside no longer felt like a humiliation. It felt like the beginning of a lesson he had not asked for, one that was now impossible to ignore. Andre did not hand the bottle back right away. He held it for a second longer than necessary, studying the little girl as if the answer he wanted was hidden somewhere in her braids, her steady eyes, or the faded backpack resting against her knees. He had spent his life trusting polished presentations, signed papers, and people who knew how to speak in clean, expensive sentences. This was different. A child with a careful voice and a mother who moved with quiet certainty had already unsettled him more than any failed meeting ever had. He looked toward the hood again, then at the woman standing near the front of the car, and the uncertainty in him sharpened into something he did not like admitting. What if they were wrong? What if they were not wrong, but simply very sure? The thought bothered him because he could not tell which possibility offended his pride more. His phone was still in his pocket. His driver was still several miles away. His schedule, for once, had no power here. That alone made him tense. The girl watched him without flinching, as if she understood that doubt was not always about the facts. Sometimes it was about a man deciding whether to let ordinary people see him stranded. Andre set the water on the roof of the sedan instead of drinking it, then folded his arms and asked the question he had been avoiding. How do you know this is not serious? The mother answered before the child could, calm and direct, saying that smoke did not lie and that waiting for pride to cool an engine was a foolish way to lose time. The words landed harder than he expected because they were not cruel. They were practical. He started to push back, to demand proof, but then the little girl pointed to a wet stain under the front of the car and asked him to look closely. It was not a child begging to be believed. It was a child making him participate. Andre bent down, and for the first time, he saw the small leak spreading beneath the vehicle. It was real. It was not dramatic, not glamorous, and not the kind of problem money could instantly flatter away. The discovery irritated him because it meant the strangers had been right, and because being right had not made them arrogant. His pride wanted distance. His need wanted truth. The gap between those two things felt wider than the highway itself. He straightened slowly, no longer certain that the danger was in the car. It might have been in the part of him that still believed help had to come from someone he already trusted. The little girl did not rush him. She did not ask for praise, and she did not act like the moment belonged to her. Instead, She simply stood beside the open hood with the same calm focus she had carried from the start, as if the broken sedan were just another problem that could be solved if everyone stopped making it harder than it was. Andre watched her small hands as she pointed to the cracked belt and then to the nearby service station sign, half a block away. Her voice was soft, but her certainty carried farther than any shout could have. The confidence in her tone made him feel, in an unpleasant and humbling way, like the one who was lost. Minutes earlier, he had been measuring the world by status, speed, and access. Now he was being guided by a child who looked too young to be this composed, and yet more grounded than anyone he had dealt with that morning. When he glanced toward the road, the passing drivers still ignored them, but she did not seem offended by that. She seemed used to being overlooked and unbothered by it. That alone unsettled him. She reached into her faded backpack, pulled out a folded cloth, and handed it to him so he could wipe the grease from his hands. It was a small gesture, ordinary to anyone else, but it landed like a lesson. Nobody in Andre's world had ever offered help with that much quiet dignity. Before he could thank her properly, she asked a simple question about whether he had called for roadside service, then listened to his answer without judgment. He admitted he had, and that he was still waiting. She nodded once, as if that explained everything. There was no pity in her face, no awe either, only a steady kindness that made room for his embarrassment without feeding it. For the first time, Andre felt something in him loosen. Not because the sedan was fixed yet, but because the child beside it had treated him like a person instead of a name. He looked at her again, really looked, and noticed how carefully she kept herself between him and the harsh sun, shifting just enough to make shade for him without ever announcing she had done it. That quiet thoughtfulness disarmed him more than any polished apology could have. It occurred to him that the world he lived in had trained him to notice power, but not care. This girl had none of his influence, none of his money, and somehow possessed the one thing he was beginning to need most: the ability to make a stranger feel safe without making him feel small. Then, just as the tension in his chest began to ease, her mother called from a few yards away, asking the girl to step back for a moment so she could check the engine herself. Andre turned toward the sound, curious and wary all at once. If the child had been this steady, what kind of woman had raised her? Andre turned fully toward the sound, and the first thing he saw was not a mechanic rushing in with tools, but a woman who carried herself like she had already solved harder problems before sunrise. She was black, sturdy in her stance, with tired eyes, a faded work jacket, and the kind of calm that did not ask permission from anybody. She wiped her hands on a rag, then nodded once toward the sedan as if she had already read its complaint from a distance. The little girl moved aside without being told twice, but not because she was small. She moved because she trusted her mother to take over. That simple confidence landed harder than Andre expected. He had spent his life paying people to act certain. This woman looked certain without needing anyone's money. "Open the hood all the way," she said, her voice even and practical. Andre hesitated for half a beat, then did it. The sound the latch made felt strangely ceremonial, like he was surrendering a problem he had been guarding too tightly. The woman stepped in close, peered into the engine bay, and pointed to a loose hose with the blunt efficiency of someone who had seen this exact trouble before. "That is the issue," she said. "Not the battery, not the tank, just that." Andre stared at her, caught between relief and embarrassment. He had expected guessing, maybe luck. Instead, she gave him a diagnosis that sounded simple only because she knew what she was looking at. The little girl watched from behind her mother's shoulder, chin lifted, as if this was exactly how the world should work. Andre noticed the faded backpack resting beside her feet, the careful way her mother kept one hand near it, and the quiet discipline in both of them. It was not just skill. It was a life built around making do without wasting anything, including dignity. He asked if they could fix it there, and the woman shook her head. "Not safely," she said. "It needs a clamp and a proper reset. I can get it close enough to move, but not enough to trust." That answer changed the shape of the moment. Relief was no longer free. If he wanted the car moving, he would have to choose between waiting for a tow, accepting help from strangers, or admitting that control could not solve everything. The little girl looked up at him then, not pleading, just watching to see what kind of man would stay honest when the easy answer was gone. Andre realized the road was not testing his patience anymore. It was testing whether he could let competence come from a place he had overlooked his whole life. Andre did not answer right away. He stood beside the dead luxury sedan, one hand still resting on the open hood, listening to the small sounds of the roadside and to the quieter sounds inside himself. The girl had not asked for anything. Her mother had not rushed to impress him. That alone unsettled him more than the broken engine. In his world, help always came with a price, a favor, or a smile sharpened into strategy. Here, it had arrived with work gloves, a tired jacket, and a child who looked him in the eye like his money did not matter. The girl shifted her weight and said nothing, but her silence felt deliberate, as if she had already learned that dignity did not need an audience. Andre found himself thinking about the last time anyone had offered him help without expecting something in return, and he could not remember one. That thought landed harder than the stalled car. For the first time in years, his pride did not feel powerful. It felt lonely. Her mother wiped her hands on her jeans and checked the engine again, not because he had asked, but because she was responsible for her own judgment and would not let him stay stuck in his assumptions. Andre watched her work and realized she was not trying to prove anything to him. She was simply refusing to be underestimated. That truth stung, because it exposed how often he had mistaken wealth for wisdom and comfort for control. The little girl noticed the change in his face before he spoke. She stepped closer to her mother, then looked back at Andre with a steady, thoughtful expression that made him feel seen and measured at the same time. He had expected embarrassment to be the only cost of this stop, but the real cost was deeper. He had to face the fact that his habits had kept him distant from people who carried burdens he had never bothered to notice. The roadside, the heat, the broken car, the mother's calm hands, and the child's quiet courage all pressed on him at once until he understood something he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Being helped by them did not make him smaller. It made his isolation visible, and once he saw it, he could not pretend it was not there. Just as he opened his mouth to say thank you in a way that felt honest, the mother paused and glanced toward the road, where another vehicle was slowing near the shoulder. Andre felt the moment shift again. Someone else had arrived, and with them came a new question he was not ready for. Was this still a chance to accept grace, or the beginning of a truth he would have to answer for? Andre did not look toward the slowing vehicle right away. He kept his eyes on the mother beside the open hood, on the steady way she held the broken place in the car, as if it were nothing more than another problem that could be named, measured, and solved. That was what unsettled him most. Not her confidence, not even her patience. It was the fact that she had never once acted as if his panic made him more important than her work. For the first time that afternoon, Andre understood that he had not been rescued by luck, money, or status. He had been slowed down by reality, and reality had come wearing work boots and tired eyes. The little girl stood near the passenger side, hugging her worn stuffed bear to her chest, still quiet, still watchful. But now he could see it clearly. She was not waiting to be noticed. She was waiting to see whether he would notice what kind of life stood in front of him and call it ordinary. The answer should have embarrassed him. Instead, it cracked something open. He thought about every time a driver, assistant, or mechanic had been treated like a tool instead of a person, every time convenience had made him blind to the people who kept his world moving. The car was only the surface problem. The real breakdown had been his assumption that help would look like less than this, speak less than this, cost less than this. Then the mother reached into her jacket and handed him a small folded receipt from the nearby gas station, the kind he had ignored when she first mentioned it. On the back, in quick handwriting, she had listed the exact part that had failed, the price of towing, and the nearest shop that still had it in stock. Andre stared at it, then at her, and finally understood why she had not rushed to impress him. She had already done the work. She had already made the road smaller for him. He felt a sharp, unfamiliar sting of shame, not because she had helped him, but because she had done it without asking him to be anything other than honest. That was the turn. The help he needed was never only about the car. It was about admitting that he had mistaken speed for strength, wealth for readiness, and distance for control. He looked at the mother again, then at the little girl, and this time he saw the invisible weight they carried with a clarity that made his own burden feel childish. Before he could speak, the approaching vehicle slowed fully and pulled over behind them. Its door opened, and Andre realized the roadside problem had just become a social one. because whoever had arrived next would see exactly what kind of man he was when he no longer had a polished answer ready. The door of the second vehicle opened, and for one suspended second Andre expected judgment to step out wearing a suit. Instead, a broad-shouldered man in a faded work jacket emerged, then looked past Andre without interest and went straight to the mother. "You still have that jumper cable?" he asked, like this was only another roadside inconvenience in a long day. The mother nodded once, pointed to the trunk, and the man went to help without asking who Andre was or why his expensive car was stranded there. That small lack of ceremony unsettled Andre more than criticism would have. He was used to being noticed, measured, and managed. Here, nobody seemed impressed by his name, his watch, or the kind of life that usually opened doors before he reached them. The little girl watched the new arrival with calm, then looked back at Andre as if waiting to see whether he would learn anything. When the mother stepped away to fetch the cable, Andre finally realized how little he had understood about the people who had stopped for him. They were not volunteering because they expected favor, payment, or praise. They were helping because the problem existed and because ignoring it would have been wrong. That thought landed harder than the broken engine. It forced him to see his own instinct to doubt them, to calculate them, to keep them at a distance. The man in the work jacket found the cable, but before he could kneel by the hood, the mother returned and stopped him with a glance that carried years of knowing. She checked the battery terminals, brushed her fingers over a loose connection, and said, "This is not the alternator. It is the ground." Her voice was calm, certain, and completely unbothered by Andre standing there, as if the whole world had narrowed to her hands and the engine. Then she turned to the little girl and told her to hold the flashlight steady. The girl obeyed at once, proud to be useful, and Andre felt something inside him shift again. He had arrived expecting rescue to look like expertise, money, or authority. Instead, it looked like a mother trusting her daughter with an important task, a child rising to it, and strangers cooperating without making a performance of kindness. The repair was simple once the problem was named, but what it changed in Andre was not simple at all. He saw how often he had mistaken confidence for value, and wealth for wisdom, and silence for weakness. The mother had not begged for his respect. She had earned his attention by knowing exactly what to do. The little girl had not waited to be chosen. She had stepped in with steady hands and a serious face, as if she already understood that dignity was something you practiced. Andre crouched closer, not to supervise, but to listen, and in that lowered posture he felt the first crack in the pride that had kept him separate from people like them. When the engine finally turned over with a rough but loyal sound, relief moved through the group, but Andre did not rush back to the safety of his own control. He looked at the mother, then at the girl, and understood that the real breakdown had never been only mechanical. The question now was whether he could leave this shoulder of the road unchanged, or whether he would carry their lesson into a world that had taught him to overlook exactly the kind of people who had just saved him. Andre stayed beside the shoulder of the road long after the first rush of relief had faded. The engine still ticked beneath the hood, but the louder change was inside him. For years, he had treated delay like failure and strangers like background noise. Now he was looking at a woman who had used calm hands, clear thinking, and hard-won patience to solve what his money and speed had not. Beside her stood her daughter, small and steady, holding the same quiet courage that had changed the day. Andre reached for his wallet, then stopped. Cash would have been the easy answer, the kind that kept distance intact. Instead, he asked the mother for her name and wrote it down in his phone with the same care he would have given a board meeting. That simple act unsettled him more than he expected, because it meant he was no longer treating them as temporary helpers on the side of a road. He was making room for them in his life. The mother, practical as ever, told him the repair shop nearby was honest but busy, and that he should have the car checked before he drove far again. Andre listened. He did not interrupt. He did not correct her. He simply nodded, and in that small silence, something old in him began to crack. The little girl looked up at him and asked whether rich people ever got lost on purpose, because that seemed easier than admitting they did not know how to stop. Andre almost smiled, but the truth in her question landed too cleanly. He had spent years believing control was safety, when in reality it had only kept him lonely. He thanked her mother, then thanked the girl, not as a gesture, but as an admission. The road had broken his car, but they had broken his habit of looking away. When the tow truck finally arrived, Andre did not climb in with the old impatience of a man eager to escape. He looked back once, memorized the shape of the woman and child against the afternoon light, and understood that the real journey had already begun. Andre had expected the tow truck to be the end of the story, but the girl's mother was already standing beside the road with her hands folded, calm in a way that made the air feel steadier. She did not speak like someone trying to impress him. She spoke like someone who had seen trouble before and refused to let it define the day. "You should not drive that car any farther," she said, looking past the damaged hood and into the man behind it. Andre almost answered with habit, with money, with the old certainty that a repair could fix anything. Instead, he watched the little girl clutch her backpack and step closer to her mother, as if she trusted the truth more than the man's title. That quiet trust unsettled him more than the breakdown ever had. The mechanic from the tow truck climbed out and started checking the front end, but the mother was the one who noticed what Andre had missed. The warning light on the dashboard had been blinking for days, and the car had not failed suddenly. It had been warning him, and he had ignored it because he was used to being the one in control. He felt the heat rise in his face as the realization settled in. This was not only about a broken car. It was about a life built on speed, assumptions, and the luxury of not listening until something stopped moving. The little girl looked up at him with steady eyes and asked if he was going to let the tow truck driver take him home, or if he was going to leave the car and come talk for a minute. Andre almost laughed at the simplicity of it, but there was no joke in her face. So he did the rare thing. He closed the door, left the keys with the mechanic, and walked a few steps away from the machine that had carried him everywhere. The mother did not chase him. She simply pointed toward the shade of a nearby tree and invited him to stand where the wind was cooler. There, with the broken car behind him and two strangers in front of him, Andre heard what he had not wanted to hear all morning. The kind of help he needed was not mechanical. It was the kind that began when pride gave way to listening. He looked at the girl, then at her mother, and understood that they had not just saved his day. They had interrupted the way he had been living it. Andre said nothing for a long moment. The wind moved through the branches above them, and for the first time all morning, he did not try to fill the silence with another explanation, another promise, another excuse. He simply stood there, letting the truth settle in. Clara watched him with the steady patience of someone far younger than him, yet far less distracted by pride. Miriam rested one hand on her daughter's shoulder and kept her eyes on Andre, not harsh, not soft, just clear. That clarity did more than any polished mechanic or urgent phone call could have done. It showed him that what had failed beside the road was not only his car. It was the habit of thinking every problem could be fixed by speed, money, or command. He looked at the cracked dashboard through the open door, then at the dirt on his shoes, then back at the woman who had quietly taken control of a moment he had expected to own. "I need to understand this differently," he said at last, and the words felt heavier than any order he had ever given. Miriam nodded once, as if she had expected him to arrive there eventually, but Clara's face changed first. She had not come here to impress him. She had come because she saw a man who was lost and knew her mother could help. That simple truth made the air between them feel new. Andre understood then that the help he had received was not charity and not luck. It was a correction. A small black girl had noticed what a billionaire had missed, and her mother had turned that noticing into action. In return, he saw something he could not unsee: the dignity of people who lived without being protected by money, and the loneliness of a man who had used wealth to keep everyone at a distance. The question now was no longer whether his car would run again. It was whether he would return to the same life after it did. Clara glanced toward the road and then back at him, as if reminding him that choices only mattered when they were made in time. Andre felt the old certainty leave him, and in its place came something rarer and far more difficult to carry. He was no longer the man who had been stranded by a broken engine. He was the man who had been forced to see what his life had cost him, and what it might still become if he had the courage to stay changed. Andre stayed still for a long moment, as if the weight of Clara's words had settled into the ground beneath his shoes. The road was quiet now. The broken engine no longer seemed like the thing that had brought him here. It had only been the door. What waited beyond it was far harder to face. Clara's mother stood a few steps away, calm and steady, already holding the small metal canister and the cracked toolbox like she had carried heavier burdens before and never needed praise for it. She did not rush him. She did not ask for thanks. She simply waited, and in that waiting, Andre felt something in him begin to shift. For years, he had treated time like a weapon and distance like protection. He had learned how to solve problems quickly, keep people at arm's length, and leave before anything touched the parts of him that still hurt. But here, on this narrow road with dust on his shoes and humility in his chest, none of that helped him. The only thing that mattered was the choice in front of him. Clara had already seen that. Her mother had lived it. He had not. Yet he could not ignore it now. She knelt beside the car again and said the engine would need a full repair before it could go anywhere safely. That meant delay. It meant money. It meant admitting that he could not simply command the day back into place. Andre looked at the cracked windshield, then at Clara, then at the woman who had spoken the truth without trying to wound him. He asked what the repair would cost, and when she answered, he did not argue. That small refusal to protect his pride changed the air between them. Clara's mother told him there was a service road 5 miles ahead where a mechanic might still be open before sunset, but only if they left soon. Andre understood then that the real test was no longer whether the car could be fixed. It was whether he would let this moment pass him by, or whether he would go where he had never meant to go and speak to people he would once have ignored. Clara reached into her worn bag and handed him the folded map she had been keeping safe the entire time. It was not a gift of paper. It was an invitation to choose differently. Andre took it with both hands, as if taking the map meant taking responsibility for everything he had almost missed. Then he opened the driver's door, not as a man demanding control, but as someone finally willing to be led by the truth.